Now let me discuss populism in mid-20th century Latin America. And populism is a little difficult to define because it wasn't a political ideology, and instead, populism was a political style, and it emphasized a special connection between leaders and the people. And often, these populist leaders, they would denounce the enemies of the people. And who were the enemies of the people in mid-20th century Latin America? The old oligarchy, for example. Those few elites at the top of the political system who had ruled Latin America ever since independence, and just those handful of families that controlled the exports, they started to lose their power with the revolutions during the early 1930s and the Great Depression, and these populist leaders arise beginning in the 1930s. And often these populist leaders would also denounce foreign imperialists, the foreign powers who had exploited Latin America's wealth and had left the region undeveloped economically. And as I mentioned, these populist leaders, they arise during the Great Depression and during World War II in this changing atmosphere and the rising tide of nationalism throughout the region. And some of the characteristics of these populist leaders, they were very charismatic and energetic. They could speak the common person's language. They knew how to communicate and speak the phrases of your ordinary citizen in Latin America, right? They didn't speak like an out-of-touch elite leader. And they were also very energetic, giving lots of speeches to the people, showing up at factories. In Mexico, the president goes out to the countryside and visits villages, attending rallies. And these populist leaders were often concerned with the poor. They put poor people included them as part of their political agenda. And as I mentioned, they had excellent communication skills as well. And I would argue that Latin America, under these populist leaders, certainly becomes more democratic. Now, these populist leaders did have their authoritarian side where they would use force to suppress their enemies. But when I say Latin America was more democratic, I mean that more people were partaking in the political process than had been before. Latin America, these countries were still not fully fledged democracies the way we think about it in the United States as with representative democracy, but more people were included in the political process under these populist leaders. And some of the main issues that these populist leaders addressed were things such as voting rights and elections. These populist leaders, they won elections and they modernized the electoral systems and they expanded voting rights. It was during the mid-20th century when every country in Latin America gave the right to women to vote, and it occurred at different times in different countries, but basically from the 1930s through the 1960s, women would gain the right to vote in Latin America. So they expanded the electorate. And all of these populist leaders were very nationalistic as well, right? They were always denouncing the foreign imperialists and always extolling Latin American culture, the individual cultures and history and traditions of these countries. And all of these populist leaders also addressed industrialization. I spoke already about this changing economic system that was occurring during these years and the rise of import, substitution, industrialization. All these populist leaders saw industrialization as a way to modernize Latin American economies and to lift their people out of poverty. And another big issue that these populist leaders dealt with was labor relations. Organized labor unions became a very important block of support for these populist leaders. And this is when a lot of labor regulation was passed. So minimum wages were instituted, unions were recognized, safety regulations in the workplace were instituted during these years, because we all know in the early 20th century, factories were very dangerous places to work. But these populist leaders, they want to address a lot of these issues that workers face on a day-to-day basis. And people from all walks of life supported these populist leaders. Of course, they were very unpopular among the old oligarchy, but the middle class supported the populist leaders. Urban workers did. The urban poor did. Students, artists, business people, white-collar employees, professionals, feminists, intellectuals. They had a broad coalition that they put together that enabled them to come to power and to exercise power for quite a long time in many cases. And in general, they embraced popular culture. And they would reach out to people who had been excluded from the political process, such as the poor. Also children of immigrants, particularly in Brazil and in Argentina. They were also the populist leaders reached out to them and wanted to include them in the vision of the nation. So now I want to talk about a few of the specific and famous populist leaders. Every country had a populist leader at one point or another during this period. And we'll read about Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. He started out as a populist, but would go on to become a dictator. And we'll also read about populism in Guatemala as well. But here I want to just briefly discuss the most famous populist leaders in Latin America. And there were the big three, as they're kind of known. And they were Lázaro Cárdenas of Mexico, Getulio Vargas of Brazil, and Juan and Eva Perón of Argentina. So I'll just say a few things about each one of their governments here. Cárdenas, who you see here on the left, he ruled Mexico from 1934 to 1940. And he was the one who oversaw the great reforms of the Mexican Revolution. During his tenure, 45 million acres of lands were redistributed to peasants in the mid-late 1930s. And think about that, 45 million acres. It radically changed land tenure in the countryside. And it reached 750,000 rural families that benefited from this land redistribution. And it was about 12,000 villages. And he also oversaw the construction of 12,000 rural schools. So this is when many villages throughout the country got their first teachers and schools that were built during these years. And it was also during his presidency when the oil was nationalized. And I talked about the oil nationalization in our previous lecture. And on the top right is Getulio Vargas of Brazil. And he ruled Brazil from 1930 to 1945. And he actually came back to power in the early 1950s. And he was only in power for a few years in the 50s. But he would actually commit suicide when he was in office in 1953. And he had become unpopular at that point. And there was a lot of voices that were criticizing him. And he committed suicide. But during the 1930s and 40s, Getulio Vargas, like all the populist leaders, he increased the scope, size, and importance of the federal government. And in all these countries, power was also being centralized into the national capital. And Rio de Janeiro was the capital during these years. And Vargas, he invested in workers' housing projects, electrification, and he expanded health services and schools also. And in Brazil and Argentina, and in most places, most of these reforms were concentrated in the cities. It was really only Mexico where a lot of these nationalistic and populist reforms reached the countryside. Brazil in the cities such as Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Vargas was also very important during World War II. I showed you a picture in the previous lecture of him seated next to Franklin Roosevelt. And Brazil, the northeastern part of the country, is called the Brazilian Bulge because it bulges out, that part of South America bulges out into the Atlantic Ocean. And that was a very strategic part for the United States' air campaign in Africa during World War II. And in the bottom right is Juan and Eva Perón, and they came to power in Argentina in 1946. And again, they pursued many of these reforms, raised wages, they offered workers, low-cost government services. And Juan Perón he was a very popular labor leader who had been in government beforehand. And his wife, Eva Perón, who was probably the most famous woman in 20th century Latin America, she was beloved by the people also. She had been an actress and a well-known radio personality. And she also helped to promote the inclusion of women into the political process. So, of course, this was when women got the right to vote in Argentina. And, one thing I will say about women under these populist leaders is that these leaders, they were not promoting feminism. They were including women in the political process and extending the right to vote to women, But Eva Perón, for example, she emphasized the traditional gender roles of women as being mothers and caretakers and living in the house. So in our readings in the next few weeks, not just this week, we'll go into more detail about populism, and particularly in the Dominican Republic, and we'll see Guatemala in the 1950s. Will have populist governments come to power that seek to redistribute land to the indigenous Maya. And we'll see that the United States would oppose that, and this will all take place in the context of the Cold War.